Hello and welcome. This week on Diplomatic Channel, UN Secretary General talks racism, inequality, and calls on leaders to raise their ambitions during the Nelson Mandela Lecture 2020 speech, which held virtually for the first time since its start. We'll be speaking to the South African High Commissioner to Nigeria, Ambassador Tammy Seleco, on the legacy left behind by Mr. Mandela and some of the issues raised by the UN Secretary General in his lecture. Those are the highlights this week. Welcome to the program. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Let's check in on other discussions in diplomatic circles. Luxembourg's Prime Minister Javier Bettel has called for respect of rule of law and European values to be conditions for a vast stimulus plan for the coronavirus-hit EU economies. Leaders spent 3 days at a summit haggling over a deal on a €1.8 trillion economic recovery package. As of Sunday, Bettel said 3 main points remain to be discussed: the total amount of the EU's long-term budget and recovery fund, and the governance and rule of law. Huawei says it will continue to pursue innovations and serve global markets despite the UK's decision. Vice President of Corporate Communications at Huawei, Joe Kelly, made the remarks after British Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced on Tuesday that the UK will stop purchasing Huawei 5G equipment and will stop using all Huawei 5G equipment by 2027. He says Huawei will be unaffected by the UK decision, and it is still used in many other countries and markets around the world.
And we know from very clear research that when you remove Huawei from a national market as a competitor in terms of infrastructure, the infrastructure itself from competitors typically rises in price by maybe 30%. So, you remove competitors from the marketplace, then the cost is going to increase. So that's one of the advantages of Huawei, is that we keep markets competitive in terms of cost. We also keep markets competitive in terms of innovation.
Meanwhile, China says it will respond resolutely to any attempt by Britain to sanction Chinese officials following the imposition of a security law in Hong Kong. Earlier this month, Britain introduced a new sanctions regime to target individuals it says are involved in human rights abuses or organised crime. Some lawmakers in the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Conservative Party, have said the sanctions should be used to target Chinese officials.
I think the UK should have its own independent foreign policy rather than to dance to the tune of Americans, like what happened to Huawei.
Welcome again. And just before we begin, we'd like to wish a speedy recovery and good health to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Jeffrey Onyama, who discovered over the weekend that he has contracted the coronavirus. We also wish everyone who's come down with this disease a speedy recovery and good health following. Our prayers continue to be with those who've lost loved ones to this terrible disease, and pray for them to be comforted. Now to the program. Following our discussion last week about the U.S. policy of cancelling visas for foreign students whose university programs have moved online because of the coronavirus, the U.S. government rescinded its decision, a policy which would have subjected foreign students to deportation if they did not show up for class on campus, has thrown the higher education world into turmoil during a time when a lot of them were contemplating whether or not to reopen. Harvard University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, filed the first of a litany of lawsuits seeking to block the decision, which they said left no room for debate or appeal. On Tuesday, however, just before a federal high judge in Boston was to hear arguments on their challenge, the judge, Alison Burroughs, announced that the administration had agreed to rescind the policy and allow international students to remain in the country even if they're taking all their classes online. According to the U.S. government, the requirement that students take at least one in-person class was actually more lenient than the rule that had been in effect for close to 20 years, which required foreign students to take most of their classes in person. Also over the weekend, a third evacuation flight of 324 Nigerians from the United States arrived in Abuja from New Jersey on Saturday. According to the Nigerians in Diaspora Commission, the evacuees tested negative to COVID-19 before boarding, and are currently on the 14-day self-isolation as mandated by the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19 and the NCDC. Another flight from the United States is scheduled for July 25th, also from Newark Airport, paid partly for by the Oni of Ife, Oba Adeye Eniton Gumusi. We also understand Nigerians in the United Arab Emirates are arriving this week, having complied with the COVID-19 conditions for their travel. But now to today's program. Since 2003, the Nelson Mandela Annual Lecture has invited many prominent people, world leaders in some instances, to debate on significant social issues. Personalities like former U.S. Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, to religious leaders like Archbishop Desmond Tutu and more, have drawn attention to global issues such as diversity, cohesion, and social justice, good governance, as well as constitutionalism. This year is the first time the lecture has held virtually and not in South Africa, owing to the global pandemic. The lecturer was the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on the topic, tackling the inequality pandemic, a new social contract for a new era.
Behind policies for peace, our planet.
The UN Secretary General began his lecture reminiscing about the time he had met the former South African leader Nelson Mandela before his death. Incidentally, this year's Mandela Annual Lecture comes in the wake of the passing of Mr. Mandela's daughter, Ambassador Zinzi Mandela, earlier in the week.
I thank the Nelson Mandela Foundation for this opportunity and commend their work to keep his vision alive. And I send my deepest condolences to the Mandela family and to the government and people of South Africa on the untimely passing of Ambassador Zinzi Mandela earlier this week. May she rest in peace. I was fortunate enough to meet Nelson Mandela several times. I will never forget his wisdom, determination, and compassion, which shone forth in everything he said and did. Last August, in my holidays, I visited Madiba's cell at Robben Island. I stood there, looking through the bars, humbled again by his enormous mental strength and incalculable courage.
And then he delves into the present global pandemic, which he says poses the greatest risk to the most vulnerable, the aged, those living in poverty, people with disabilities, and those with pre-existing conditions.
Dear friends, COVID-19 is shining a spotlight on this injustice. The world is in turmoil, economies are in free fall, and we have been brought to our knees by a microscopic virus. The pandemic has demonstrated the fragility of our world. It has laid bare risks we have ignored for decades: inadequate health systems, gaps in social protection, structural inequalities, environmental degradation, the climate crisis. Entire regions that were making progress on eradicating poverty and narrowing inequality have been set back years in a matter of months. The virus poses the greatest risk to the most vulnerable, those living in poverty, older people, and people with disabilities and pre-existing conditions.
Recent months have seen huge support for anti-racism protests around the world, something the UN Secretary General addresses under high levels of inequality, discrimination, abuse and lack of access to justice. He says addressing inequality must start by reforming global institutions.
In this way, inequality works against human development for everyone. We all suffer its consequences. High levels of inequality are associated with economic instability, corruption, financial crisis, increased crime, and poor physical and mental health. Discrimination, abuse, and lack of access to justice define inequality for many, particularly indigenous people, migrants, refugees, and minorities of all kinds. Such inequalities are a direct assault on human rights. Addressing inequality has therefore been a driving force throughout history for social justice, labor rights, and gender equality.
Amidst other issues such as poverty, the climate crisis, and digital globalization, Mr. Guterres calls for a new model for a global New Deal, a redistribution of power, wealth, and opportunities.
We need a new global deal at global level with an effective transfer of resources to the developing world for them to be able to address those gaps. But at the same time, when building back better, it's not only addressing inequality, it's addressing other fragilities. Climate change does make does make sense to go on distributing subsidies on fossil fuels. We need to make sure to invest essentially on the green economy. Of course, there are transitions that need to be addressed. South Africa has a legacy, and that legacy, of course, is based on coal. It takes time, it's complex, it needs to be. That's why I speak not only about climate action, I also speak about climate justice. We need to be able to address those that will be impacted negatively by climate action. But it is essential that when building back better, we build back with inclusiveness and with sustainability.
He then closes the lecture with a warning that the world is at breaking point.
And in case you didn't know, Nelson Mandela was a South African anti-apartheid revolutionary. He was a political leader and a philanthropist who became the country's first black president and the first elected in a fully representative democratic election from 1994 to 1999. He also served as the president of the African National Congress Party from 1991 to 1997. Before this, he had served 27 years in prisons, but between Robben Island, Pollsmoor Prison and Victor Verster Prison. He was released in 1990 by then-President F.W. de Klerk. Throughout his time before prison and out of prison, he was regarded as a controversial figure. Critics called him a communist terrorist, but he gained international acclaim for his activism to make South Africa free of its colonialists and free to choose its own leaders. He received more than 250 honors in his lifetime, including the Nobel Peace Prize. He is known and fondly remembered and described as Madiba, the father of the nation to some. We have joining us on the program the South African High Commissioner to Nigeria, Ambassador Tammy Seleco. Ambassador Seleco is a teacher, a diplomat, and a flexible leader with strong interpersonal skills developed through his passion for education and development. He once served as chairperson, National Education Union of South Africa, before becoming the Director General of the Department of Health. He also joined the diplomatic service in 2010, becoming the South African High Commissioner to the Federation of Malaysia, from where he was then appointed to the United Republic of Tanzania, where he served from 2015 to 2019. He resumed in Nigeria in October last year as High Commissioner of South Africa. Ambassador Tammy Seleco, thank you for joining us today.
Good evening. Good evening to all listeners.
Your first tour of Nigeria, how do you like it so far?
Well, Nigeria is a wonderful country. It's a country of very loving and nice people, and it's a country of historical significance in the world, cultural heritage. It's a wonderful country. I'm enjoying myself so far, save the COVID-19 situation.
Yeah, that's a bummer for many people. But what do you hope to achieve during your stay in the country, knowing Nigeria and South Africa share cordial relations that have sometimes been marred by crime and criminality?
One of the key objectives of our current government is to ensure that we take the agenda, the African agenda, back at the helm of our foreign policy. And critical to that, of course, is the strengthening of a relationship with very strategic countries, Nigeria being one, and in fact, perhaps one of the most important countries in relation to ensuring that we together move forward Agenda 2063. So my first objective is to ensure that we lift the level of relationship, the level of confidence in one another, the level of consultation to actually beyond the levels we had before between, for example, President Begi and President Obasanjo, which in fact, fortunately, have been revived by the current president of Nigeria, Mr. President, and our president of South Africa, Ramaphosa.
And since we're on the subject, Ambassador, how can both countries improve those ties in such a way that issues such as attacks on citizens is brought to the barest minimum, as some of these attacks we saw recently over the past 2 years?
One of the key mechanisms is for governments, the two governments, to constantly monitor the situation, and therefore they've both actually establish what is called the mechanisms that would actually give us a sense of what is happening immediately, and also to share information with regard to criminality and so on. But critical to this is an understanding of between people. And so we have to actually ensure that the people-to-people relations are improved more than the government-to-government relations, which in fact are generally good, but people-to-people relations are still very much challenging.
We'll take a short break now. Diplomatic Channel, we'll be right back. The reason for this conversation is the late Nelson Mandela, whose birthday fell on Saturday, July 18th. He was known as Madiba by many and spoken in very beloved terms by many still. Do you have memories of the late leader?
Well, where can I begin? Personal memories will actually take me back many years. But let me start by saying that when Madiba came out of prison, he came out at the height of internal violence in South Africa, particularly in the province I come from. And of course, he came preaching the gospel of peace and asking our people to lay down their arms against each other, which in fact was a very good message, but could not be received at the time very well by people who were in the midst of that violence, like myself. So I remember, I have very fond memories of a time when we visited that province and we differed. The two of us differed together with my other comrades very much in terms of how to approach the issue of violence. And that was Madiba in general, that in many instances, he was able to rise above the current context and actually see a very far, because now looking back, I believe that he was quite correct, and maybe even though we were also correct ourselves, but if we didn't really follow his leadership, we would have been in very serious messes. The other memory of Madiba that I have is one of somebody who actually related to you personally. In fact, as an international leader, he received so many individuals and so many people to see him. But if he met you as a person, you would feel that this leader is actually interested in me as a person, not just in the generalities of protocol and how to meet people, but he was actually interested in your personal life. In fact, if you met him again and he had asked you how many children you had and what they were doing, you'd be surprised 2 years later when he actually asks you by name, what happened to your son, what are they doing now, etc., etc. That's another humanity and humility of the man that actually I have as a memory. I can go on and on, but that's not the platform for that.
Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to meet him, but as you say, many know him as a man of peace, a man of integrity, an upright man, and yet seen as the father of the nation of South Africa. And when you look at South Africa today, apart from July 18, when everyone remembers the ideals of Madiba, do you think his legacy has been held up well by those left behind?
I think all of us are struggling to actually keep up to the legacy of Madiba. And of course, we are struggling because we are actually almost 20 years after our democracy, and the realities of the impact of apartheid and its colonialism are actually coming to the fore. They are also coupled by the realities of some of the challenges that we have had in the recent years, where corruption has actually grown rampant and so on. And so it's very difficult to see the legacy of Madiba being lived. But I believe that many of our leaders, including the current leadership now, are actually always putting that as a kind of beacon, as a mirror that we continue to all compare ourselves to reflect on the country and this direction. So not only the leadership, but the people always hold that leadership accountable on the basis of the values of Madiba. And so his memory and his legacy lives in that it's actually still keeping us on check. And when we go astray, that mirror tells us, now you're astray.
Ambassador, sadly, this year's annual lecture on what has happened on what would have been Madiba's 102nd birthday, it's almost smeared by the death of Zinzi Mandela, a colleague to you. How significant is it that Zinzi joins her father the week of his birthday?
Well, it is such a sad thing that we lost Ambassador Zinzi Mandela. And in fact, she could have been buried on the same day as the celebration of her father's legacy, because we ended up having to lay her to rest on the 17th, which was Friday, in order to ensure that the proceedings of the 18th would actually continue. It is actually very significant because we would have to always remember that just before, whenever we go to the 18th, we would also be remembering Zinzi, who in her own right was very poor and champion of transformation. And really at a young age became a very powerful voice, even speaking on behalf of her father at the time when her father was not allowed to speak for himself. So it is significant in that sense.
And finally, there is the coronavirus is staring the whole world in the faces. Sadly, South Africa has the highest number in Africa. We're still looking at this as a global problem. Secretary General Antonio Guterres did point out in his address that Nelson Mandela once said, one of the challenges of our time is to reinstill the consciousness of our people, that sense of human solidarity, of being in the world for one another and because of and through others. Has South Africa felt that human solidarity during this pandemic?
Well, let me enter that question from Madiba's conclusion of his The Long Walk to Freedom. His last part of that Long Walk to Freedom, his book, he says, I need to pause a little bit to enjoy the vista, to take in the road that has been traveled, but I can't do that long because the road ahead, the walk to freedom, is still a very long one. There are many bumpy roads. COVID-19 is one of those bumpy roads. And we've reached a point where it's impacting on particularly the poorest of the poor, particularly those that are actually vulnerable in many ways. And of course, solidarity, particularly in the African continent, has been very, very important. We commend, through the leadership of President Ramaphosa, the leaders of Africa who have come together and said, we need to fight this together through solidarity, and they've created funds and mechanisms to support one another. That's the start of solidarity. But there's a solidarity at the level of the people on the ground, where people look after one another. Their neighbors cannot be left to be not to be looked after, not to be provided with food, not to be provided with the shelter they need. So we have seen from the ground level right up to the top of the leadership of our continent that solidarity is something that we really need during this time of crisis of COVID. We can't say the same thing about the whole world, but at least Africa as such has shown the way that we as Africans can do it together, and we can do it in solidarity, and we can do it for Africans.
You almost sound like Madiba himself, Ambassador. Thank you again. This has been a pleasure speaking with you. And thank you for joining us on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
And this is where we end the program this week. Thank you for watching. Remember, all the addresses to reach us on are on your screen. You can catch up with other editions of Diplomatic Channel on youtube.com/channelsweb. I'm Amarachi Ubani. I'll see you next time.